Have you ever felt like the moment you started growing, the world around you began to shrink? At first it's subtle, a quiet shift. You begin thinking a little differently, asking questions you never dared to ask before. You say something deeper in a conversation and suddenly there's silence. Friends laugh nervously. Loved ones tell you to lighten up. They don't say it outright, but something in their eyes changes. You're no longer easy to understand, and that makes you dangerous. What you're feeling isn't in your head. It's the invisible tension that comes when one person dares to evolve while the others cling to comfort. In the beginning, your transformation feels like awakening, but soon it begins to feel like exile. Because the moment you outgrow the cage calls you ungrateful. And that right there is the true beginning of inner strength. It begins quietly, not with conflict, but with subtle discomfort. You start to think differently. Maybe you pause before saying what you used to say without hesitation. Maybe you start asking questions you never dared ask before. You begin to notice things, patterns, truths, lies, and before you know it, you're changing. Not because someone told you to, but because your soul simply refuses to sleep any longer. But the world doesn't celebrate this. Not really. At first, it's just a shift in tone, a joke that carries too much weight, an awkward silence after you speak your truth. Friends who once shared everything now seem distant. Conversations become shallow, safe, performative. You haven't done anything wrong yet, somehow your presence begins to feel intrusive. Why? Because your evolution disrupts their comfort. When you change, it's like holding up a mirror one you never intended to lift. And without speaking a word, that mirror reflects everything others are trying to avoid. Their fears, their stagnation, their dependence on a reality that tells them this is good enough. But when you start stepping out of that frame, they feel betrayed, not because you've hurt them, but because you've exposed a possibility they aren't ready to face. They say they care. They might call it concern. You've changed, they whisper, as if it's a crime, and in their tone is something deeper than worry. It's a request. Come back. Come back to the person who didn't challenge them, the person who smiled and nodded, the person who played the role they needed to feel safe in their own inaction. This is where many people turn back, because they don't want to lose connection. They don't want to be misunderstood, so they silence their evolution to preserve relationships that were never built to withstand truth. But if you're still here, if you're still listening, it means you didn't go back. And that's why this path is both sacred and brutal. Because growth is not just about what you gain, it's about what you're willing to lose. And most people aren't prepared to lose the illusion of belonging. But you are. Or at least you're starting to realize that maybe the cost of staying small is greater than the cost of being alone. Here's the raw truth: your mental awakening will always be a threat to those still asleep. Your decision to live with depth makes others feel shallow. Your clarity exposes their confusion. Your courage highlights their avoidance. And none of this is your fault, but it will be your burden. Because the price of awareness is alienation. And yet this is not a tragedy. This is a sign that you're alive in a world that fears consciousness. A sign that you're shedding the layers that were never truly you. And though it hurts, though it stings to be the one who walks alone, know this: it's better to walk alone in truth than be surrounded in a lie. Because real strength begins when you stop asking for permission to grow. No one tells you this at the beginning. Building a strong mind comes with a price, and it's not one you can pay with effort alone. It costs you relationships. It costs you comfort. It costs you the illusion that you can grow without shaking the ground beneath your feet. Because here's the truth: that few are brave enough to speak. Strength isolates you. Not because you push people away, but because your strength begins to unsettle those who still live in weakness. Your clarity becomes too sharp for small talk. Your depth too uncomfortable for shallow minds. You don't fit into rooms that once felt safe, not because you've changed too much, but because you've grown too real. It begins with a quiet awareness: the things that once comforted you no longer do. The ideas you used to defend now feel hollow. The roles you played, the masks you wore, they start to feel like betrayal. Not betrayal of others, but of yourself. And so you shed them. But the moment you let go of who you were, the world reacts. Friends grow silent. People start to avoid you. Not because you've become unkind, but because you've become unsettling. You carry the weight of a mind that sees through illusion, and most people are still married to illusion. They need it to feel okay. you will be called intense, arrogant, cold, even dangerous. Why? Because your mind no longer bends to social scripts. You no longer nod along to nonsense. You no longer seek to be liked, and in a world addicted to validation, that alone is an act of rebellion. This is what no one tells you. A truly strong mind doesn't just disturb others, it terrifies them. Because a strong mind does not beg, it does not flatter, it does not conform. It reflects back to others the work they have refused to do. And that's why they pull away. That's why they whisper. That's why they ask you to be who you used to be. But you can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unlearn your awakening. And so you walk forward not because it's easy, but because it's the only honest thing left. You begin to walk a road without signs, without a map, without applause. And in that silence, something extraordinary begins to happen. You stop performing. You stop negotiating your truth. You stop asking for permission to exist. You begin to belong to yourself. And that is the price. That is the pain. But that is also the power. Because when you no longer fear being misunderstood, you become unstoppable. So if right now you feel alone, judged, or broken, understand this: you are not failing. You are evolving. And evolution never happens in the crowd. It happens in solitude and struggle, in the kind of silence that strips away everything false until only the real remains. This is the price of building a strong mind. And though it may cost you everything fake, it will give you everything true. There is something unsettling about a person who no longer seeks permission to think. Not because they are loud, not because they argue, but because their very presence becomes a quiet rebellion, an unspoken challenge to everything that is stagnant, shallow, and safe. When you begin to cultivate a truly strong mind, you don't just evolve personally. You disturb the system, you disrupt the social contract built on collective comfort and unspoken agreements. You break the mold, and society has never liked mold breakers. Why? Because a free-thinking individual is a danger to collective mediocrity. Most people do not live intentionally. They live inside borrowed beliefs, hand-me-down values, second-hand dreams. They survive in a system that rewards obedience and punishes originality. So when someone comes along who refuses to accept the script, who thinks for themselves, who questions the illusion that everyone else has agreed to pretend is real, it creates friction. You become the unwelcome variable. You're not playing the game. You're not nodding along. And that makes you a threat, not because you're wrong, but because you're different. You expose what others have spent their whole lives avoiding, the possibility that maybe they're not really free. Maybe they built their lives on comfort, not truth, on repetition, not purpose. This is why mediocrity doesn't just resist greatness, it resents it. It mocks what it can't understand. It demonizes what it fears. And it disguises that fear with moral language. You're arrogant. You're selfish. You're too intense. But underneath those words is a desperate plea. Please stop being more than me. It reminds me that I chose less. And here's what you must understand: collective mediocrity is not enforced by tyrants. It's maintained by the crowd. Not by chains, but by consensus. Not by violence, but by validation addiction. It's the quiet pressure to conform, to be liked, to be safe, to not be too much. But if you want to build a mind that's truly unshakable, you must be willing to violate those unspoken rules. You must be willing to be misunderstood. You must be willing to walk into rooms where your authenticity makes people uncomfortable and stay there. Because your strength is not an offense, it's a mirror. And when the herd sees that mirror, they'll do everything they can to shatter it. Not because of what you've done to them, but because of what your existence forces them to see in themselves. So yes, a strong mind is dangerous. It will unsettle your circle. It will challenge your culture. It will confront your past, but it will also liberate your future. Because in a world that teaches you to shrink, to obey, to conform, simply choosing to think is the most radical act of all. When Friedrich Nietzsche declared God is dead, the world misunderstood. Some took it as a celebration of rebellion, others as a nihilistic collapse. But what Nietzsche was really offering wasn't a victory cry, it was a warning, a profound psychological turning point. He wasn't attacking a divine being. He was dismantling an illusion, the illusion that someone or something outside of us is responsible for our meaning, our morality, our lives. For centuries, people looked up to the sky for answers. They outsourced responsibility to tradition, to religion, to social systems that promised order even if it was false. But Nietzsche tore down that sky. He shattered the comfort of the idea that there's a cosmic plan, that suffering has some automatic higher purpose, that everything will be explained in the end. When he said God is dead, he was pointing to the death of certainty, the end of excuses, the collapse of the external scaffolding that once held up our psychological world. And what are we left with ourselves? Utterly alone, with no script, no divine manual, just chaos and the terrifying freedom to build from it. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes radical, not because it denies meaning, but because it demands that you create it. You don't get to hide behind doctrine. You don't get to blame society, your parents, or fate. You are the builder now, the artist, the architect of your values, your choices, your life. That is liberating, but it is also unbearable for many. Because freedom in Nietzsche's world is not light, it's weight. There's no more sky to cry to, no more judge to please, no salvation coming from above. Everything rests on your shoulders. And most people, when faced with this truth, collapse. Not because it's wrong, but because it's real. It strips them of the safety nets they've clung to for years. It forces them to confront their own passivity, their refusal to act, to define, to stand. But if you can bear this burden, something extraordinary begins to happen. You stop waiting to be saved. You stop looking for approval. You stop asking life for a path, and instead you carve one out yourself. Nietzsche called this moment the beginning of becoming, the moment when man transforms from a follower into a creator, from a victim of life into the author of it. This shift isn't comfortable. It's brutal. It demands the death of who you were so that the truth of who you can become has space to emerge. But within that death lies your deepest power, the realization that you are enough to begin again. So if you feel the ground shaking beneath you, good. It means you're standing where God's used to be. Now it's your turn to rise. In a world obsessed with comfort, Nietzsche dared to say what no one wanted to hear. True strength is born in suffering. Not in ease, not in calm, not in the soft lull of positivity or the shallow rush of motivational slogans. No real power is forged in the fire of chaos. In the moments that rip you apart, strip you bare, and leave you staring into the abyss with nothing left to cling to. Most people run from that abyss. They medicate it, distract themselves from it, pray it away. But Nietzsche did something different. He stood at its edge, and then he jumped in. Because he understood what nature itself has always whispered, growth does not come from stability. Transformation never arrives in moments of peace. It comes when the world falls apart, when your beliefs fail you, when your identity crumbles, when everything you thought was solid dissolves into uncertainty. That's where the real work begins. Nietzsche's famous line, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star," isn't just poetic, it's psychological, it's biological, it's existential. The chaos he speaks of isn't external, it's internal. It's the storm inside you, the doubt, the fear, the brokenness. And without that inner fragmentation, without that collapse of the old self, nothing new can be born. We live in a culture that romanticizes healing but demonizes pain. We want the breakthrough without the breakdown. We want transformation without trauma. But that's not how nature works. That's not how the soul evolves. You want to be strong? Then stop running from your suffering. Stop asking life to make it easier. Start asking yourself to become stronger. Because here's the paradox, the very things you're trying to avoid, the heartbreak, the failure, the isolation, those are the raw materials of power. They are the weight that builds muscle in the soul. They are the fire that burns away what is false and reveals what is real. Think back to the moments that shaped you most. Were they the easy days, the calm seasons? Or were they the nights you thought you wouldn't survive? The losses that brought you to your knees? The chaos that made you question everything? That's where strength was born. Nietzsche didn't glorify pain, but he refused to lie about its necessity. He saw suffering not as a punishment, but as a portal, a rite of passage, a test. And only those who dare to walk through it come out the other side with something unshakable, a spirit that doesn't break a mind, that doesn't beg a will, that refuses to die. But this isn't handed to you. You have to earn it in silence, in solitude, in the places no one claps for you. You have to bleed without applause. You have to rebuild without recognition. And in doing so, you discover something rare, the ability to not just survive the chaos, but to navigate it, even dance within it. This is where the weak flee, but it's where the strong are born. So if you're in the middle of that storm, don't run. Stay there. Let it remake you, because when you emerge, you won't just be healed, you'll be dangerous. What happens when a human being no longer seeks validation from others, when they no longer bend to collective morality or fear the weight of solitude? Nietzsche gave that answer in a single word: Übermensch, the overman, the one who has transcended the limitations of the ordinary man, not through domination, but through self-mastery. The Übermensch is not a superhero. He doesn't wear a cape, doesn't fly, and doesn't need applause. He is not defined by power over others, but by absolute power over himself. He is the individual who has died to conformity and been reborn in authenticity. He lives not to fit into a world already made, but to create a new one in his own image. In Nietzsche's vision, this isn't a metaphor, it's an existential blueprint. The overman is someone who has overcome guilt, herd morality, the need for approval, and the fear of standing alone. While most people spend their lives asking, "Is this allowed?" the overman asks, "Is this worthy of me?" His compass is internal, not external. His morality is self-made, not inherited. But let's not pretend it's easy. Becoming the Übermensch means you must break with everything you were taught to hold sacred. You must kill the version of yourself that still begs for permission to be. You must face the suffocating silence of not belonging anywhere. And you must find your voice within that void, without applause, without encouragement, without a safety net. This is not a path for the weak. This is not for those still trying to please the crowd. It is a path of exile, of confrontation, of ruthless self-honesty. And yet within that isolation lies a freedom most will never taste. The freedom to live without compromise, to speak without self-censorship, to move through the world untouched by collective fear. That's what makes the Übermensch dangerous, not because he harms others, but because he shows others what's possible. He doesn't fit in. He stands out, not for attention, but because his soul has outgrown the cages that most still call home. And people will hate him for that, because the Übermensch forces them to see themselves not the polished version, but the unfulfilled version. He becomes a mirror they never asked to face. And in that reflection, all their compromises, all their cowardice, all their suppressed dreams rise to the surface. But this is what makes the Übermensch necessary. In a world addicted to conformity, someone has to remind us what sovereignty looks like. In a culture obsessed with comfort, someone has to show us the beauty of discomfort. In a society that rewards submission, someone has to stand tall and say, "I will not shrink to make you feel safe." This is not arrogance. This is alignment. This is what happens when a human stops being a reflection of the world and becomes its author. So if you feel the call not to rebel, but to rise, don't ignore it. The path to becoming the Übermensch may be lonely, but it is the most powerful evolution a soul can undergo. If there is one truth that every awakened mind eventually collides with, it is this: the stronger your mind becomes, the lonelier the path will feel. This is not the loneliness of physical solitude, but something deeper, existential. It's the ache that arrives not because you're alone, but because you're no longer understood. The people you once connected with now look at you like a stranger. The conversations you once enjoyed now feel hollow. The spaces that once felt warm now echo with emptiness. Why? Because freedom comes at the cost of belonging. When you free yourself from the opinions of others, you simultaneously let go of the comfort those opinions once provided. You stop participating in the emotional economy of approval and validation. And when you no longer need applause, you realize just how much of your identity was built around earning it. This is where most turn back, not because they lack courage, but because they're terrified of abandonment. And it's a valid fear. The path of individuation, the process of becoming your true self, demands a break from the herd, and the herd will not let you go quietly. They will call you distant, arrogant, cold. You'll hear them say you've changed, and they're right. You have, but not in the way they think. You're not above them, you're just no longer dependent on them. And in a world where emotional dependence is normalized, that independence feels threatening. Nietzsche understood this dynamic intimately. He walked that path himself, misunderstood, exiled, ridiculed. He knew that the price of radical authenticity is isolation, but he also knew that isolation is not a curse, it's a crucible. It's the sacred fire in which false identities are burned away and the true self is revealed. Because only in silence can you hear your real voice. Only in the absence of noise can your inner compass recalibrate. Only when you're stripped of external input can you begin to trust the wisdom within you. But let's be honest, it hurts. There will be nights when the silence feels suffocating. Mornings when the absence of familiar faces makes you question everything. There will be a deep ache to return, to rejoin the crowd, to laugh along, even when it isn't funny, to nod, even when you disagree, just to feel connected again. But that ache is a test, because if you betray your truth just to be accepted, then you haven't grown, you've only shape-shifted. And real transformation isn't about blending in better, it's about standing alone when necessary, holding the line, protecting your voice even when no one else wants to hear it. Mental freedom isn't glamorous. It doesn't come with confetti or cheers. It comes with stillness, with grief, with the radical realization that you no longer fit where you once belonged because you've outgrown the role you used to play. But if you can bear this space, if you can sit with the silence long enough, you'll discover something sacred. You were never meant to belong to the crowd. You were meant to belong to yourself. And in that fierce solitude, your soul finds its true shape, not as a mirror of others, but as a light of its own. Tyranny doesn't always wear a crown or carry a gun. Sometimes it speaks in soft voices, smiles politely, and tells you to be reasonable. It doesn't come from above, it comes from beside you, from your peers, your colleagues, your community. It is the quiet tyranny of collective mediocrity. This kind of oppression is subtle but far more dangerous, because it's invisible. It wears the mask of morality. It cloaks itself in normalcy, and it convinces you slowly and gently that greatness is arrogance, that ambition is selfishness, and that authenticity is a threat to others' comfort. You've felt it before, haven't you? That moment when you dared to speak an honest opinion and the room fell silent. When you expressed a dream that was too big and they laughed it off. When your clarity made others defensive. When your independence was labeled as cold or your strength as intimidating. That wasn't random. That was the crowd reacting, not to you, but to the mirror you held up. Because when you choose to rise above, you disrupt the false harmony that mediocrity has built for itself. Nietzsche called this phenomenon slave morality, a value system born not from strength, but from resentment. It's the morality of the many who could not become great, so they twisted the very definition of greatness to soothe their own inadequacy. In this moral inversion, humility becomes cowardice rebranded as virtue. Obedience is labeled as goodness, and those who dare to stand tall are painted as dangerous. But don't be fooled, this isn't about ethics, it's about control. The crowd doesn't want you to be small for your sake, they want you small so they don't have to grow. Because every step you take beyond them becomes an accusation they never asked to hear. Your courage becomes a confrontation. Your uniqueness becomes a disruption. Your rise becomes a threat. So what do? They isolate you, mock you, dismiss you, not with violence, but with consensus, with the weight of repetition, with the slow erosion of your self-belief through shame and silence. They don't break you, they wear you down. And many fall to it. Not because they're weak, but because the cost of standing out feels too high. They return to the fold head down, voice muted, light dim, convinced that peace is better than purpose. But that is not peace. That is quiet desperation in disguise. So if you find yourself being pushed away, criticized for thinking differently, shamed for walking your own path, take it as a sign. You're not failing. You're frightening them. Because in a world built to suppress originality, authenticity is an act of war. And yet it's the only war worth fighting. Not against others, but against the version of yourself that still craves their permission. The self that still asks, is this too much, instead of asking, is this true to me? Collective mediocrity cannot withstand the presence of someone who refuses to shrink. So stand tall, speak truth, live large, be the disruption they didn't see coming. Because every time you choose to be fully yourself, you remind the world of what's possible, And that alone is a revolution. To become unbreakable is not to become hard. It's not to become numb or emotionless. It's not the absence of feeling, it's the ability to feel everything and yet not be destroyed by any of it. It's the silent power that grows when you've been shattered and chose to rebuild, not into who you were, but into someone new, someone untouchable from the inside out. This kind of transformation doesn't happen on a sunny day. It happens in the storm. When you lose everything that once defined you, when people walk away, when your identity collapses and the ground beneath you vanishes. It's in that free fall, that terrifying descent into nothingness, that you begin to find the truth that your worth was never tied to anything outside of you. Becoming unbreakable means no longer negotiating your value. It means you stop asking the world, "Am I enough?" and start answering it for yourself. Not loudly, not for attention, but quietly in the stillness of your own knowing. And that stillness is built, not bought. You earn it in the moments no one sees. The nights when you cry but don't collapse. The mornings when you rise without motivation. The hours spent sitting with your pain until it teaches you something. You build it in silence, in solitude, in your refusal to break even when everything inside you begs to give up. This is not a path for those who want applause. In fact, the further you go, the quieter it gets. People start to fade. Opportunities disappear, especially the ones that require you to shrink. You stop being nice, you stop being agreeable, and that confuses people because they don't understand that you're not being cruel, you're being clear. Clarity terrifies those who live in confusion. Presence disturbs those who rely on distraction, and truth threatens those who've built their lives around lies. So yes, you will lose things. Friendships built on convenience, careers built on compliance, opportunities that require silence over truth. But what you gain in return is worth more than anything the world could offer: integrity. Not the moral kind, but the structural kind. Wholeness. The kind of alignment that makes you immovable, not by arrogance, but by certainty. When you reach this place, you stop fearing the opinions of others because you no longer need their validation. You stop fearing failure because you realize you've already survived worse. You stop fearing isolation because you've turned solitude into your sanctuary. This is the final transformation, not into someone who has all the answers, but into someone who can no longer be shaken by the questions. Someone who can look chaos in the eye and remain calm. Someone who has faced themselves and made peace with the war inside. And from that peace comes power. Quiet, unshakable, eternal. So if you feel yourself changing, if you feel yourself breaking, keep going. Because what's breaking is not you. It's everything that was never strong enough to hold the real you. Life application, living the truth. No one told you. Real growth isn't comfortable, and it was never meant to be. The journey to mental strength begins when you stop outsourcing meaning, approval, and identity. It begins when you realize that pain is not your enemy, it's your teacher. That loneliness isn't punishment, it's the birthplace of authenticity. In a culture obsessed with fitting in, the greatest rebellion is learning to stand alone. When you choose truth over comfort, self-ownership over validation, and inner clarity over external praise, you begin to access a version of yourself that cannot be broken. The world may not applaud it, in fact, it may resist you, but that resistance is proof you're stepping into who you truly are. So stop asking for permission to evolve. Start living like your life is your responsibility, because it is. And the moment you fully claim it, everything changes.